Greetings everyone. We present to you the video on the topic the Los Angeles School Difference, Politics and City, from the class of Planning History and Principles. The video is presented to you by Manya Shukla, Rohit Bhatt, Seemant Singh, and Richa Sharma, first year, Masters in City Planning, IIT Kharagpur. First things first, we start off by defining the Los Angeles School. The Los Angeles School of Urbanism is an academic movement which emerged during the mid-1980s, loosely based at UCLA and the University of Southern California, which centers urban analysis on Los Angeles, California. The paper follows a threefold approach to the descriptive study of the La School. The first step is examination. The paper examines how a distinct framework has been picturized and formalized through the integration of the Marxist theories with the post-structuralist and post-modern theories in order to deal with the contemporary city and the issues faced, of which a major one was of the deep-rooted socio-spatial differences within the residents of the city. The second step is procedure. The process through which the La School planned to tackle with the existing situations of the city was through division. The socio-spatial separations that already existed were looked upon as a potential driving force for enhancing the overall lookout of the city, its development and further growth. The different fragments of the society and its differences were dealt individually, and their issues were focused and worked upon. The third step in generational transportation. The third discussion is upon a generational shift in the La School, where the scholars retain the concept of differentiality, while correlating it with the process of development and modification of the city and its associated politics, and the future study process. The study starts with a discussion of how the city of Los Angeles and the thought of urbanism was studies, what all means and methodologies were available at disposition and used, and the major outcomes of the study. Urban forms. It goes on to further discuss the prevalent and hypothesized urban forms, including how the city was moving forward, the living patterns of the people, the behavior, status and lookout of the society in general, and what all measures were proposed or planned for modification of the then contemporary. Generalizability. Although the main study and observations were based in and around the city of Los Angeles only, the researchers did test out the generalizability of the study, that is, how easily and optimally can the theory and concepts be applied to different cities and towns across the world, which are developing or behaving in a same or similar manner. Also, they thought about, for how long, after the development of a strong base study plan, with respect to the continually changing world, would the study, and the school as a whole, be applicable and dominant? Differences versus diversity. Socio-spatial differences were predominant in the city and the urban society. However, the different generations of the LA school looked upon those differences differently. The first generation looked upon it as differences, as stoppages to the way of development and improvement of the city and society. However, the upcoming researchers saw it as diversity, which could be channelized to become drivers of the same desired results. Comparison. At the time when the LA thought was developing, the Chicago school was already a predominant thought of urbanism, but not applicable to a setting like LA. Hence, a contrast is drawn up. LA school the thought and efforts put into the LA urban study could have been simply been a study or a research. We also discuss what exactly led to the Los Angeles study to become a school. Theory incorporation. The pioneers of the school drafted out a theory and understanding of the complete scenario. After that comes the important step of actualizing the solutions to the problems spotted out and the theory thus drafted. Intellectual role. The LA school was, and remains to be, a hub of a large number of students, researchers, scholars, and pioneers working under the urbanism head. It had the contribution of a large number of study-oriented theorists at its core in LA, who contributed a lot of different ideas and ideologies into the thought. Now, we shall discuss in brief the stepping stones and situations of the Los Angeles thought, study, and further, a generationally differing University of California, Los Angeles, and the University of Southern California started examining urban restructuring processes through theories. Observation pointed out that Los Angeles stood much different from the prevalent Chicago school, and was a unique setting in its own, requiring a fresh study of the prevalent urban setting of the city. Although the LA urban study proceeded on being a school from a study on similar lines, it had some sharp contrasting features and elements from the Chicago school, which was a prevalent focus of study then. The city of Los Angeles, by that time, was a polynucleated, late capitalist urban area with multisectoral differences, and a center too weak to impose any sort of stringent rules, laws or regulations. Conceptual framework was mainly drawn out of the Marxist theory, post-structuralism. Why a school instead of a study? Though sharply contrasting in many manners, the reasons why both the LA school and the Chicago school became a school of urbanism is strikingly similar. Hence, we will first have an insight about the Chicago School. Reasons for such dominance of the Chicago School were jotted down by Thomas Girin, and they include pointers like 1. Common theoretical and normative positions. 2. Institutional cohesion, and 3. Mechanisms for testing and disseminating. The Los Angeles School, developing and reaching heights in the 1980s and the 1990s, became a school on behalf of the following pointer. 1. The Center for Origin of the Study focused the study upon theoretical, methodological, and political parameters. 2. This provides a framework to interpret the urban agglomeration and its growth and expansion. 3. Institutions provided for the study and research base. For example, urban planning and geography at UCLA and geography at USC. 4. Institutional base promoted interaction between the students, researchers and pioneers of the study, bringing together ideas and intellectual thoughts. Through the involvement of a number of institutes, and the associated students, scholars and researchers, working together upon the entire study, the supposed study and ideas propagated to Europe. Now, we are going to discuss the theories about the differences which provided the base for the Los Angeles School. The Chicago School and La School both examined how sociospatial differences shape urbanization processes, but what are those sociospatial differences that shape the urbanization process? Different social groupings being divided geographically is referred to as sociospatial differentiation. Numerous social, economic, cultural, and political elements operating at both the macro and micro levels are responsible for the dynamics of sociospatial difference. Now, we will see the theoretical framework of the Chicago School. According to Émile Durkheim, the process of social differentiation involved both social fragmentation and social integration. Moreover, the concentration of people in large, heterogeneous and densely populated urban centers accelerated fragmentation by making it difficult to form strong and durable ties with others. The structural forces, such as industries, etc., favoring fragmentation made society prone to disintegration and individuals prone to anomie. The secondary institutions could perform needed social integration functions by providing new mechanisms to bind the differentiated masses into a common system of rules and norms. Parties, the military, state educational systems, and professional associations were best positioned to assume these integration functions. When these institutions failed to perform these functions, higher rates of deviant behavior and social problems would arise and threaten the stability of the system. Thus, Durkheim argued that the structure of industrial societies accelerated processes of differentiation and fragmentation, but that such processes were counterbalanced by secondary institutions that performed crucial social integration functions. To understand how the process of differentiation plays out over urban space, the Chicago School turned to the social ecology theories of Herbert Spencer. For Robert Park, competition between different groups typically resulted in the dominance of one group over others within the city. A stage of equilibrium was reached when institutional mechanisms were established to regulate the interactions of different groups within and across the different social spaces of the city. At this climax stage, exogenous disturbances such as natural disasters, migration, etc. produced instability in the system, weakening the capacities of institutions to perform integration functions. The weakening of social integration controls was reflected through increased deviancy and social problems in the areas where these disturbances were felt the most, i.e. zones of transition. Once the institutional grid adapted to these disturbances, e.g. integration of migrants into the system resumed its stability and equilibrium. Differences are labeled as one of the major reasons for urban problems in the USA. Without common rules, these turned into permanent competition and fragmentation. Sociospatial differences as well as the failure of secondary institutions to integrate these differences lead to system-threatening problems. The Los Angeles School, theorizing difference with Marx and Foucault. What is distinctive about the La School has been its efforts to draw liberally from both Marxist and post-structural theoretical traditions. Rather than reproduce a theoretical binary between these traditions, La School writers combined insights from both to inform their analysis of differences, conflicts, and crises in late capitalist urban systems. The Marxism of the 1970s and 1980s had a strong influence on the early La School. Social differentiation in capitalist societies, i.e. class differences, was a principal cause of instabilities and crises in the system. Crises were direct and necessary results of the system itself rather than the Chicago School's premise that exogenous causes, such as immigration, momentarily upset a previously stable system. Secondly, the theory of uneven development was a spatial offshoot of crisis theory. Capitalists created and reproduced sociospatial inequalities to ensure their continued survival. While the strategy of geographical unevenness allowed capitalists to overcome one potential crisis, i.e. the tendency of the profit rate to fall in advanced economies, this particular strategy planted the seeds of new rounds of systemic crisis. Each crisis of capitalism produced its own round of economic restructuring and uneven urban forms and structures. While these spatial fixes provided a temporary reprieve from a mounting crisis, they also planted the seeds of the next crisis directly into the socio-spatial fabric of the city. Now, we will discuss the post-structuralist assertions, which played important roles in shaping the La School's conception of difference. Power is expressed through a range of institutional sites, for example prisons, clinics, asylums, etc., and addresses a range of issues concerning the human condition, for example freedom, sexuality, the body, etc. A core structure, i.e. capitalism or the state, does not produce a singular logic of power which orders the different pieces of society into a coherent whole. Pluralism operates at a general social and individual level. This stresses the absence of a structural center to order these plural subjectivities into internally coherent hierarchies within the social system or within us. Where there is power, there is resistance. People resist the expression of power in countless ways. Each institutional site produces its own points of conflict, unstable subjectivities, and struggles in the world. Rather than institutions serving to integrate an increasingly differentiated society, they play the opposite role, they multiply power, subjectivities, and conflicts. Real places or places of disorder open up possibilities for individuals to escape the technologies of power and exercise a greater degree of freedom within their worlds. Heterotopias are hypothetical locations where all other real sites existent in the culture are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. The difference is conceived in radically plural ways. Power is plural, subjects are plural, politics are plural, and the concentration of incompatible pluralities in time and space creates unstable places within society. New class divides mixed with new ethnic forces to produce a radically differentiated social and spatial structure. The city now became an open field of diverse socio-economic nodes, with the different nodes spinning down the urban fabric in decentered and uneven ways. The radical diversity found in the city destabilizes traditional identities and blurs the boundaries separating one group from the other. The cacophony of multiple subjectivities in the same city facilitates new hybrid identities and the multiplication of heterotopic places throughout the urban region. The research strategy of the La School resembles the general theory, case study feedback loop characterized by Buravoy, 1998. General theorizations on the city framed their interpretations of the concrete case, and insights learned from case studies were used to adjust, modify, and expand general theories of the late 20th century city. For these scholars, the dynamics of differentiation described above played out in a series of urbanization processes. Each process was conceived as being relatively autonomous from the other. They operated according to a distinctive logic of their own, but they also fed back into one another to create a dynamic of accelerated socio-spatial fragmentation. Descending economy, economic crisis, restructuring, agglomeration of economy, cycle of urban development, cycle of capitalism. Most contributors to the La School agreed with the Marxist assertion that the cycles of capitalism and urban development are strongly related to one another. Reconcentrate capital, reconcentrate labor. Soja and his colleagues argued that a central strategy for overcoming economic crisis in capitalism has been to reconcentrate certain aspects of capital and labor processes in certain places while dispersing others across space. Contemporary city. In response to the economic crisis of the 1970s, capitalists embarked on a series of strategic maneuvers that radically altered the shape of contemporary cities. Organized industries. Post-Fordism. La researchers drew upon the regulation school to argue that those industries that did survive in places like Los Angeles were increasingly organized according to post-Fordist principles. Flexible production systems. Medium-sized firms, small-sized firms, agglomerations. Firms increasingly embraced new models for organizing the production process, which centered on more flexible production systems where small and medium-sized firms were linked to one another in agglomerations of transaction-intensive networks. Improved abilities of firms. Innovation capacities. These agglomerations improve the abilities of firms to reduce uncertainties, respond to new information, trends and competitors, contain labor costs, and maximize collective innovation capacities. High technology, entertainment, garments. Agglomeration economies were unevenly spread throughout the urban region, with specialized production systems, i.e. high technology, entertainment, garments, etc., defining the economic and social character of the different areas of the region. Global North less durable, Global South more durable. The Fordist crisis of the 1970s therefore resulted into responses. One, durable manufacturing had begun to be dispersed in the Global South. Two, less durable manufacturing dispersed in Global North like in Los Angeles. To differentiating the social structure, polarization, and ethnic diversity. Radical differentiation. Plant closings to overlapping processes contributed to the radical differentiation of the social structure of cities. Firstly, the process of economic restructuring, globalization, labor-saving technologies, and plant closings weakened the durable manufacturing sector in most large American cities. Lower-level jobs, mid-level jobs, top-level jobs. As the supply of middle-income jobs in durable manufacturing declined, growth in other sectors, in high technology, intense craft, finance, etc., contributed to the expansion of jobs at both the top and bottom ends of the occupational structure, but relatively weak growth of mid-level jobs. These different factors combine to create a new pattern of inequalities characterized by a high degree of occupational and earnings polarization. Secondly, several waves of immigration transformed American cities into spaces of intense ethnic and racial diversity. The Hart-Celler Act of 1965 opened the door to a flow of Asian immigrants responding to provisions for skilled foreigners. These processes were seen as transforming the social structures of all advanced capitalist cities, but these scholars maintained that such processes were particularly advanced in Los Angeles. Nowhere can one detect the shape of emerging America better than in La, where newcomers to the United States have transformed the country's second-largest metropolis in complex ways and have set the region on a new course sure to be followed by other urban areas. The capital held by some Asian migrants resulted in a unique pattern of integration that departed from traditional understandings of assimilation. This was characterized by both rapid economic integration and continued residential segregation of upper-middle-class migrants in ethnic communities. Civil conflicts in Central America during the 1980s resulted in another round of migration of Latinos to major urban centers like Los Angeles. The predominance of low skills in this population channeled many into the low-end labor market, transforming this group into a new urban proletariat. The economic restructuring described above therefore intersected with major demographic changes to produce a new and highly differentiated social landscape. The end of the temporary migrant program in 1962, Bracero program, prompted Mexican migrants to settle in the United States and triggered a powerful process of chain migration. 3. Differentiating the spatial structure, making the polycentric city region a dominant tendency in recent decades, has been the rise of an urban form characterized by multiple poles of socio-economic activities. The increased importance of agglomeration economies plus intensified social differentiation have been the primary motors of decenting the socio-spatial structure of urban areas. In Los Angeles, these social and economic processes intersected with pre-existing institutions and spatial forms to accelerate its fragmentation into a polycentric region. Los Angeles was different from older industrial cities where population density and a downtown core dominated urban form. The early adoption of the automobile and the rapid construction of freeways in the post-war years consolidated the city's distinctively flat form. The post-Fordist turn in the urban economy triggered important changes in the spatial structure of the region as activities in the most dynamic economic sectors, entertainment, technology, finance and insurance, crafts, etc. Economic agglomerations served as magnets for new residential developments, rather than being satellites of heavy industry and blue-collar workers or suburbanized office and retail nodes. These new outer cities are large conglomerations of technologically advanced industry and service, huge new shopping and leisure-oriented complexes, and high-income and expensively housed technicians, managers, and professionals, sprawling science-based new towns. These multiple poles have become structuring forces of regional development, with the new poles of urban growth in the periphery stretching and pinning down the urban fabric in a recentered regional constellation of cities agglomerated in different districts throughout the metropolitan region. In modernist urbanism, the impetus for growth and change proceeds outward from the city's central core to its hinterlands. But in postmodern urbanism, this logic is precisely reversed. The evacuated city core no longer dominates its region. Instead, the hinterlands organize what is left of the center. By this, we mean that urban space, time, and causality have been altered. 4. Decenting governance, weak socio-spatial integration plus diffused repression. The law school employed general theories to explore governance issues in the Los Angeles case. 3 elements characterize the modes of governance in the late 20th century city: weak regional institutions, a desiccated welfare state, and heavy dependence on repressive techniques. The combination of these traits produced modes of governance with very weak mechanisms to integrate urban regions undergoing intensified differentiation along social and spatial lines. In such a context, power was exercised through repressive techniques tailored to the conditions of the different spaces found in the urban region. In Los Angeles, the weakness of overarching institutions resulted from 3 events. Laws restricting municipal annexations like Los Angeles to grow and absorb the suburban municipalities on its edges. Los Angeles to grow and absorb the suburban municipalities on its edges allowed residents to create new municipalities out of suburban tracts by contracting out expensive so new municipalities created quickly at suburbs. Lastly, middle-class suburbanites were effective in conveying their political will through a dense network of homeowner associations. HOAs provided residents with an infrastructure to roll back property taxes, resist racial integration, and enhance the punitive powers of the local state. Thus, limits on municipal annexation, the facility of municipal incorporation, and a reactionary and highly mobilized suburban social movement reinforced the decentralization of political power and blocked the development of regional institutions that could integrate the urban system along spatial lines. Homeowner associations roll back property taxes, resist racial integration, enhance punitive power of local state poverty and homelessness. The increase in poverty and homelessness during the 1980s resulted in cuts in welfare provisions. In addition to the massive reductions in federal subsidies to city-like revenue to Los Angeles was further reduced by severe cuts in property taxes and welfare expenditures. Strong-armed policing in the city, thousands of fortified zones, and barricaded inner-city gated municipalities as the local state lost its capacity to integrate the radically different spaces and groups that make up the metropolis. A fearful middle class embraced law and order policies and private security measures. This carceral culture favored strong-armed policing in the city's poorest neighborhoods and the widespread use of privatized security measures in prosperous areas. This transformed the urban landscape into thousands of fortified zones, ranging in scale from privately guarded homes to barricaded inner-city neighborhoods to entire gated municipalities. Thus, the weakness of institutions contributed to intensifying socio-spatial fragmentation rather than mitigating it. 5. Urban consciousness as pluralism unbound. Hyperreality and hybrids. The region's fragmented and decentered character has blurred the real and imagined boundaries that once underpinned modernist categories for knowing the world, whereas the socio-spatial structure of the modern city reinforced traditional cognitive constructs based on rigid binary logics. The blurred character of the postmodern metropolis has rendered such schematic constructs useless for mapping and knowing new urban worlds. This pattern of urbanization has also favored the production of places where incompatible differences are juxtaposed to one another, i.e. heterotopias, with each of these places contributing to the erosion of modernist ways of knowing the world. Mutually beneficial goals in ideological, racial, class, spatial context alliances are based on pragmatic concerns for achieving mutually beneficial goals rather than the truthfulness of one ideological position or another. 5. Urban consciousness as pluralism unbound. Hyperreality and hybrids. Neither the liberal strategy of redistribution and equality of opportunity, nor the socialist strategy of class struggle is entirely rejected. Instead, both are recast and tactically combined in a more open cultural politics of justice that is relational, contextualized, situationally specific, and achievable primarily through strategic coalitions that confront and redirect the social, spatial, and historical workings of power. Thus, Postmetropolis provides an environment that is conducive to a new postmodern imaginary characterized by hyperreality and hybrid cultures and identities. Next generation ideas on deference in political ways. One overlooked aspect of the LA school has been the importance of ties between scholars and activists. How these ties helped give rise to a new generation of LA school researchers. A generation that continued to pay close attention to the issue of difference but through a distinctly political lens. These interactions occurred in several universities, but they developed with the greatest intensity at UCLA during the 1980s and 1990s. Structuring a dialogue, theory, practice, politics, at UCLA. During the 1980s, the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Planning at UCLA housed both urban theorists like John Friedman, Edward Soja, Michael Stropper, and urban activists like Gilda Haas, Jacqueline Levitt, Goetz Wolf. Observers remarked that the divide separating these groups was rather blurred, leading to rich, combative, and dynamic conversations. Channels between these worlds were created through the graduate program and through the employment of practice faculty from the Los Angeles area. While both groups may have been oriented by different interests, professional concerns, and theoretical orientations, their common commitment to radical politics sustained deliberation and debate. Jacqueline Levitt, a faculty member, notes, this environment was fostered by institutional conditions that provided department members with a great degree of autonomy. It was prior to the university becoming conscious of its position in the university world. This provided some degree of autonomy and freedom in the things we did. There was a whole air of tolerance that was conducive to this kind of atmosphere and work. The open dialogue between radical urban theorists and radical urban activists was therefore fostered by a commitment to systemic, urban change and a great degree of institutional autonomy. In addition to the traditional tension between intellectuals and activists, the more theoretical members of the faculty were rooted in structural Marxism. That is, capital logic, crisis theory, uneven development. The activists were more interested in issues of politics and agency as expressed through the discourse of class struggle. For urban theorists like Soja, understanding the structure of the system would reveal the points of crisis that created opportunities for progressive social forces. The activists, on the other hand, were less interested in locating structural opportunities and more interested in making opportunities by building up the political power of the masses. For them, the central theoretical question was how to maximize the political power of the working class in cities like Los Angeles. The focus on theory and structure won out during this time, as most of the senior faculty continued to focus on the structural forces driving differentiating, crisis and restructuring. Increased competition between universities reduced departmental autonomy and compelled policy and planning programs to conform to a standard non-critical model. This general process resulted in the department's incorporation into the School of Public Policy, which had as one of its goals to become a West Coast version of Harvard's Kennedy School. Not only did this reduce the ideological autonomy of the faculty, but it also marginalized the non-permanent practice faculty, helping to weaken one of the most important links between the regular faculty and practitioners. In an interview, Jacqueline Levitt said that, once the university restructured, they, the practice faculty, were never respected and never provided with decent work conditions. Once that happened, those of us talking to each other had less opportunities to do so because people either bailed or went to their own sources of funding. This resulted in reforms that made interactions between radical activists and scholars more difficult. These moves slowly weakened the conditions that made the department a unique place for urban theory and practice in the United States. The new LA School, a new generation emerges. In spite of its marginalization, the practice faculty and some supportive faculty continued their efforts to turn university resources out to progressive battles throughout the city. Senior faculty found themselves increasingly distant from department matters due to job changes and travels. The continued existence of channels between the department and the local activist world allowed students to think about difference and the city in particularly political ways. In this sense, the declining presence of the senior faculty opened up an intellectual space that allowed a new generation of scholars to explore politics and difference with greater rigor than had been possible in the 1980s. Many of these students had one foot directly planted in the world of theory, and the other foot firmly planted in the activist world. The mutual positionality of these students permitted many to explore issues of difference, conflict, and crisis through a more political lens. Out of this context emerged a second generation of the LA School, a generation that was strongly informed by the theoretical insights of the first generation but with a clear interest in exploring these insights through the lens of politics. Now, we draw out our list of conclusions from the brief study and discussion of the Los Angeles School. The most important contribution of the Los Angeles School has been that it gives consideration and provides thought into the way social and spatial differences exist in contemporary cities. Another highlight of the complete field of study has been its focus on integration of the Marxist and the post-structuralist and post-modern theories and the results achieved thus. Differences within the city literally made LA a city of contrast, and so was the contrast of the view researchers had about it. The first generation spotted the socio-spatial differences in the urban setting, noted down the crisis, racial differences, instabilities, and rapid changes incurred, and made attempts to resolve them through the standard procedures of structural and cultural ideologies. The next generation of students and researchers looked upon the urban differences not just as a crisis, but also as an opportunity for inclining the prosperity and development along the lines of this diversity. They included new dimensions of politics, democracy, intellect, and academic inputs. This broadened the scope and complexity of urbanism being dealt with, and also invited a large variety of stakeholders into the project. Current developments and future prospects. A number of changes have happened within time in the LA School, and are continuing to do so, and while we study about that, we will also have a look on what might be a plausible future of the LA School. The LA School developed with a large inflow of researchers and scholars taking up the study at its core. Over time, the core has weakened, as the school moves towards a process of decentralization. The connect between the members has remained, allowing them to pursue domains associated in fields of diversity, urbanism, and politics. The opportunity of core area analysis and testing decreases, however, the scope for comparative study and application and generalizability to other metropolis around the world increases. The unique environment present due to agglomeration of research and study units has substantially reduced in Los Angeles, which was the very soul of why the school developed in the first place. We end our discussion with one question about the LA School, the answer to which the future might behold. Would the separation developed within the pioneers and scholars of the LA School lead to weakening and wing away of the ideology, or would it lead to an increased dimension of around-the-globe studies and unity, resulting in emergence of the LA School again, as a contemporary innovation in contemporary urbanism?